Alright guys, welcome back, and what we want to be looking at today is how to sketch the graph of a quadratic equation. And notice that I have y equals ax squared plus bx plus c, and the reason why I have y here is because in order for you to sketch a graph on the axes, which is the x-axis and the y-axis, you have to have two variables to be able to do the plotting, and that would be the x and y variables. But just want to point this out here so you can clearly understand what I'm saying. This of course is a quadratic expression where when we were given in previous classes we're asked to factorize and things like that. This is the quadratic equation. This is normally when they're asking us to solve for the unknown, and in this case the unknown would be x. So this is what we use when you're solving for the unknown, for the two values of x. And this now is what we use when we're about to deal with graph work, because we need to have two variables for the x-axis and the y-axis to be able to successfully sketch or draw a graph. All right, so that's the difference. Expression, for example, we're asked to factorize a quadratic expression. Here we're asked to solve for the unknown, which means when you solve a quadratic equation, you get two values for the unknown. And this one here is when we're going to start graph work. All right, you need two variables x and y. All right, that's all it is. Okay, now first and foremost, it says here the graph of a quadratic equation gives a curve called a parabola, and you're going to see very soon what we mean by that. So the graph of a quadratic equation gives a curve called a parabola. And when we're talking about the graph of a quadratic equation, again, we're talking about this equation where we have the x variable and the y variable, okay? So the graph of a quadratic equation gives a curve called a parabola. Now, this curve or parabola can either be a smile or a frown, depending on the sign of A. And what A are they talking about? Well, they're talking about the A, which is the coefficient of x squared here, this A value here. And you're going to see very soon what we mean by that. So, again, the graph of a quadratic equation gives a curve called a parabola, and this curve or parabola can either be a smile or a frown, depending on the sign of the value of A. Now, here, now, to be able to sketch the graph of a quadratic equation, we need to know, one, whether the graph will be a smile or a frown, and the sign of A, whatever value A is, whether it's a negative or a value, will tell us whether it's a smile or a frown. In fact, if A is positive, you're going to get a smile, and if the value of A is negative, you're going to get a frown. And again, you're going to understand what we mean by that very soon. Now, this here, it says we need to know 5 things in order to be able to sketch the graph of a quadratic equation. One is whether it's going to be a smile or a frown, and that's depending on the sign of the value of A. And the next thing would be the roots. Now you might ask yourself, what are roots? And the roots are simply the values for the unknown when you solve a quadratic equation. Now you know already that when you solve a quadratic equation, you're going to get two values for the unknown. So whatever answer you get for the values, those are also called roots. And those are actually where the curve or parabola will cut the x-axis. And you're going to see that very soon. The next thing we need to know is the equation of the line of symmetry. And that is going to be the equation for the line that cuts the parabola exactly in half. And that is going to be easy to find. As a matter of fact, if we know the value of h, you remember h from the complete square form? If we know the value of h, then we're able to easily determine the equation of the line of symmetry. The next thing is the y-intercept. And guess what? Whatever this value is, once it's in this form, y equals ax squared plus bx plus c, whatever the value of c is, that's going to tell us exactly where the curve is going to cut the y-axis. That's the significance of this value here. It tells us where the curve cuts the y-axis. Now, the next thing we need to learn is a maximum or minimum value. Now, you're going to understand clearly the difference between maximum and minimum value in a sec. But do you remember the letter K in the completed square form? And that's the significance of K. K is going to tell us the maximum or minimum value. And Whether it is maximum or minimum is depending on whether the parabola is a smile or a curve. And again, you're going to see what I mean very shortly. All right. Now, remember what I was saying, that why is it that we need to learn the completed square form? And this is exactly why, because looking at the completed square form tells us a lot about the graph of the quadratic. All right, so let's move on. Now, take a look at this. This is an example of a parabola or a curve for the quadratic equation. Now, it says here, when the value of a is positive, we're going to get a smile. And if you look at the curve here, or the parabola, it kind of looks like a smile, doesn't it? It looks like a smile here. So when the value of a is positive, we are going to get a smile. So whenever you look at a quadratic equation and you see that the value of a is a positive value, automatically you're going to know that we're going to get a smile, automatically. Now, the roots here, R1, root 1, and R2, root 2. I'm just indicating 1 and 2 to differentiate between the two roots. Now, these are going to be the solution for the quadratic equation. How do we get the roots? When we use this equation here, have 0 on the right hand side, and we solve using either factorization method, quadratic formula method, completing the square method. This is what we use to determine the two values of x, and those two values are referred to as the roots. The next thing is h. Now notice now that the equation of the line of symmetry is x equal negative h. So whatever you find h to be, then the negative of that is going to be on the x-axis, and that is going to tell us exactly where the line, this represents a line of symmetry which cuts the parabola exactly in half. So if I know what h is, then the negative of h is that value on the x-axis where the line of symmetry is going to be drawn through to cut the parabola exactly in half. Now, the next thing that is shown on the graph is k. Now, the reason why I put minimum value here is because we have a smile. So if we have a smile, the lowest point of the curve would be the minimum value. And that is what k is. And it's actually a value on the y-axis. So that's what k is. And remember, we went through the formula with k and h already. So when you have a smile, the lowest point of the curve, that's the minimum value. Right? So that is when k would be a minimum value. All right? And of course, c is where the curve is going to cut the y-axis every single time. Let's take a look at this one. Now here we have a frown, like when you're upset. So when a is a negative value, so when the value of a is negative, you're going to get a frown. Now when you have a frown, it kind of looks like a hill, and at the top of the hill would be the maximum value. So in this particular case, when you have a frown, k is going to be a maximum value. All right, and of course, where the curve cuts the x-axis, those are the roots, the two values for x. And again, where it cuts the y-axis is c. And if we know what h is, then x equal the negative of that, yx equal, because it would be that value on the x-axis. So when x is equal to the negative of h, that is how we know the line of symmetry that cuts the parabola exactly in half. So I'm just giving you a synopsis of the two types of curves. Now, this is very important as well. Remembering the completed square form, and you've heard me mentioning a, you've heard me mentioning h, and then the negative of h, you've heard me mentioning k, and you know that this is what we use when you're solving the quadratic using the completed square form. Of course, you'd have to find h and k first. But the beautiful thing is that if you were to look at a completed square form, the beauty about the completed square form is if the quadratic is in the completed square form, it automatically is going to tell you what a is, which means you're going to know the sign of a, which tells you whether it's a smile or a frown. You're going to know h, and therefore know the negative of h, and therefore know the line of symmetry, where it cuts the parabola in half. So a here, once you're looking at the completed square form, if you're lucky enough to get the completed square form, you're going to know exactly based on the value of a whether you're going to get a smile or a frown. Based on h, then the negative of h is going to tell us where the line of symmetry is going to be here, right? And also k, you know, if it's a smile, you're going to get a minimum value. You're going to know where that value is on the y-axis. So that's the beautiful thing about the completed square form. It tells us a lot about the graph of a quadratic equation. Now, I'm going to end the video here, and when we come back, I'm going to show you, before we actually start looking at example, I'm going to actually show you why the completed square form is the exact same thing as a quadratic form. So we are very, very, very confident now what we're doing makes sense with what the original thing was. So when we come back, even though this is not our first example, we're going to take a look at the connection between the completed square form and the quadratic form, just to show you that it's exactly the same thing. So I'll see you guys when we come back.